Hello, Squad Leader fans, Advanced Squad Leader more specifically. I'm trying to learn these rules to Advanced Squad Leader, either the original game or starter kits. I've been having a really hard time getting them in my head. And so I thought what I would do is give a try of Chapter K. This is from the original Squad Leader manual. See how well I can do kind of going through these scenarios. I thought while I'm trying to learn myself, maybe I can hit the record button and see if this will be of any use or interest to anyone else. So what I did is I followed Sergeant Stoller's orders and put my squad, my 747 squad right here in B8 on board number 1, along with Sergeant Stoller. So I'll catch up in just a moment, see what we need to do next. So we'll begin at the beginning, and what we learned from day 1 of Chapter K is that we have multi-man counters, which is the squad here on the right in B8, and then we also have the single man counter, which is the leader, Sergeant Stoller, in the same hex, B8. This is board number 1, and so basically we learn that this part of the board, the nomenclature is to use the number of the board first, then the cell. So this will be hex 1B8. And then when we look at the 6 hexes that are adjacent to us, starting in the upper left there, we have hex A8, then B7, C8, C9, B9, and A9. So those are our adjacent hexes. And when we know that we're only working on one board, we don't need to say the board number. So the idea here is basically beginning to learn some of the movement factors, how they work in different kinds of terrain. So Sergeant Stoller is telling us to forward march into hex B9. So we take our multi-man counter, our squad, move it into B9, and that expends 1 movement factor. Now, Sergeant Stoller gives us an order to go into C10. That's 1 more movement factor. And then we're going to go into D9. 1 more movement factor. So far, we've used 3 movement factors. And basically, what it's telling us is we can move in any particular direction, 1 hex at a time. There's no requirement you have to go in a straight line. Zigzagging is just fine. Now we're going to move into E10. That's 4 movement factors. Then F10. That's a half of a hex. That counts as a full hex. That's our 5th movement factor. So we basically treat half hexes like any other hex, although we cannot leave the board. If a unit leaves the board, it's gone forever. And then we'll move into G10. And that moves us with a leader, a total of 6 movement factors. I'll stack these together. And that's when we would have to stop. A multi-man counter, a squad, can move up to 6 movement factors in a turn if it's accompanied by a leader. Ordinarily, if it's not, you would only be able to move 4 movement factors. There are things like roads and double time that can increase that number, which we're not going to get into at this time. So the idea is you have turns. Each turn involves some movement and then some firing. Each player gets to do their movement and so on in sequence according to the sequence of play for each turn. So we know that if a squad is moving by itself, it would only have 4 movement factors in a turn, and actually some infantry, which don't have much experience, may only have 3 movement factors in a turn. Okay, well now we're going to be moving into the woods. You see those hexes in G9, H9, and H10. Those are woods hexes. Traveling through woods takes more movement factors. It's slower going. And so if we wanted to go into hex H9, And again, we're accompanied by our leader. I'm going to move the leader onto the bottom and the squad up on top here. If we were to move this squad into H9 accompanied by a leader, it actually uses 2 movement factors. So now we've used 2 movement factors. And then if we want to go into I-10, which is a clear hex that has a road in it, that would be 1 more movement factor. So we've used a total of 3 movement factors so far. And then if we want to go into J9, we will move into that woods hex right over here. And that will expend 2 more movement factors. So now we've used a total of 5 movement factors. And then finally, we can go into hex K10, and we will have used our allotment of 6 movement factors, even though we've only moved 4 hexes, because we were going part of that through the woods. Okay, so I'm going to shift the camera over here a little bit, and we're going to continue on with some more movement. We're going to move into a building and see how that affects the movement factors. So again, we're here in K10, and we want to move towards that building over here in M9. So if we're going to move into first L9, that's going to be 1 movement factor into that open hex. And then if we go into M9, we're going to enter this stone building. Gray building is a stone building, as opposed to a wooden building, which is a brown color. That's going to take also, like the woods, 2 movement factors. So now we've moved 3 movement factors. And if we want to continue onto hex N8, which is right here, that's 1 more movement factor. So far we've used 4 movement factors. And then we're going to stop here. And I'm going to check what's next in Chapter K. Okay, we're going to continue that march. We've used 4 movement factors so far. We're going to move up here to N7, which is another movement factor for a total of 5, and then work our way along the road. And road movement, just like clear movement, also uses 1 movement factor. Now, if you move your entire movement along a road, you can get an extra hex of an extra movement factor. So an unaccompanied squad could get 5 movement factors, and with a leader, you could get 1 extra movement factor and be able to move a total of 7 movement factors if the entire movement phase is carried out along that road. We didn't do that in that last hex movement, so it only counted as a single movement factor. Now we're going to go over to U4. That's quite a ways away. It's, let's see if it's even in the sight of the camera. It's hex U4. Let's see if I can get this moved over here. Hex U4 is this building, this hex right at this intersection, kind of between these 2 buildings here. So how many movement factors do we need to get into that location? Well, as we move, we're going to do all this all in roadway movement. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 movement factors all along the road, and so that gave us that extra movement factor of 7. If the squad had been moving by itself without a leader, it would only have been able to move 5 hexes if it did all of its movement along the road. All right, so we see that there are a few buildings around here. We have a wooden building here in V4. We have this gray building, which is a stone building in U3 and other hexes. And then there's another stone building to the left here in T4. Entering any building, whether it's stone or wooden, uses 2 movement factors. But obviously, because a stone building is a sturdier material, when you're fired upon when you're in a building, you get more protection. Now, buildings also have different heights. And building levels are done in a particular way in Squad Leader. You'll notice that this building here in V4, it's a single hex building, And so it only has a single level. And the typical level of a single hex building is called the ground level. Building in T4 over here on the left, you'll see that building takes up 2 hexes. And both of the white symbols right in the center of each of those hexes are dots. So that means there is not a stairwell. So what that means is when you have a multi-hex building, it will have more than one level. It'll have a ground level and what's called a first level, which is sort of like the second floor. So that building has 2 levels. And then basically when you have a 2-level building with no inherent stairwell, that means each of these hexes has its own stairwell. You can go up or down in the level when you're in either one of these hexes. Building U3, this much larger building, takes up 4 hexes, so we know it's a multi-level building. But it will have not only a ground level and a first level, it'll also have a second level. So when you have that many hexes and a stairwell hex, which is the square in the middle of the symbol, the hex symbol, rather than a dot, that means there's a single stairwell. And that means you can only go up or down one level when you're in that particular hex. If you're, say, in this hex U2 and you are in the upper level, you want to go to the lower level, you have to first move to where the stairwell is, then go down, and then you can move back into that other same hex that you were in, but on a lower level. Now, going up or down stairs costs 1 movement factor for each level that you change. So it takes 2 movement factors to enter a building hex. And when you first enter a building, you're going to enter on the ground level. And then it takes a movement factor to change a level, either in a stairwell hex of a large building or in one of the inherent stairwells of a smaller multi-level building. One important thing to keep in mind is when we're naming buildings, we only name them by one of the hexes in that building is within. So obviously this single hex building is just building V4. This building over here could be named either building T4 or S5, depending on which hex we happen to be more interested in calling it. Same with this building, you could either call it T2, U2, U3, or V2. Any one of those hexes could be the name of the building. Now you'll see above the board here I've placed these level counters, and we're going to use those to talk about getting into different levels of the building. So if we wanted to enter building T4, entering that building at ground level would cost us 2 movement factors because we're entering a building. Now if we want to go to S5 within the same building, that will also cost us 2 more movement factors. So going from U4 to T4 to S5 has now used a total of 4 movement factors. But I've just noticed I've gotten a little ahead of myself. So we're going to put our counters back into T4 on the ground level, and rather than go right to S5, we're going to go up a level first. So these level counters allow us to do that. So if we move these over here, put the level down, and then bring our counters back onto the cell, the hex, that indicates that we have now moved up 1 level. We're on the first level of that building. And going from the ground level to the first level is 1 movement factor. So again, if we started in U4, we took 2 movement factors to enter the ground level here in T4, then 1 more movement factor to go to the first level, for a total of 3 movement factors. Now, if we want to move to S5 on the first level, we move this entire set of counters, including the level marker, and that would be 1 additional movement factor. So now we've gone 4 movement factors from hex U4 And say we wanted to now go back downstairs in S5. We then just take off this level counter and put our single man and multi-man counters back in the building, bring this off the board, and now we are have used our sixth movement factor to get to the downstairs in S5. Now we could have, as I did just beforehand, go straight from T4 to S5 using only 2 movement factors. So we just kind of did that roundabout way just to illustrate how moving up or down a level uses a movement factor. All right, Sergeant Stoller now wants us to march over to hex X5. So we're going to bring the camera over here a little bit. X5 is the bottommost cell in this very large building, right over here. So if we wanted to enter that hex from where we are now in S5, we would have 1 movement factor, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. To get into the building takes 2 factors. So typically when you're moving, I'll often count how many movement factors I've used up to that point. And now we're in X5. Now if we want to go up a level in this building, this is a large building and it has stairwells, so it's going to have not only a ground level and a first level, but also a second level. So we're going to go 1 movement factor to get us onto the first level in this new turn. Then we're going to use 1 more movement factor to get to the second level. So what we do is we bring our counters off here. I believe if I flip this around, it's going to be a second level marker. And now we've used 2 movement factors to get to the second level, the top level of that building. And now if we want to move through the building, we can go to W5 right over here. So we've used 2 movement factors to get to the second level. Here's movement factors 3 and 4 within the building to get us to W4, or W5, excuse me. And now if we wanted to move to W4, we expend 2 more movement factors 5 and 6, to get us to the second level of W4. And that ends our movement phase because we've used a total of 6 movement factors. Now it's giving us an exercise. It wants us to go all the way back to row B of the board, which is way over here on the left edge. It wants us to go to B2 in as few movement factors and movement phases as possible. And this is doing it without a leader. So our leader is going to abandon us and get over there to B2. We're going to go join our leader from the second level of W4. So let's figure out how we need to do that. Okay, so we are going to be leaving over here in hex W4, second level of that building, and making our way all the way across the board over here to hex B2, where Sergeant Stoller is patiently waiting for us. And we want to do that in the minimum number of movement factors and movement phases as possible. So let's figure out how to start here. First thing we're going to do is we can only go up or down a level in a building like this with a stairwell hex with a square when we're in that hex. So our first movement is going to have to be to get over here into X3. It's the wrong direction from where we want to go, but it's the only way we can get there in the most efficient way. So that's used 2 movement factors to get us from the second level to the first level and then the ground level. Each of those level changes will take another movement factor. So getting us to the ground level here in X3 uses a total of 4 movement factors. Now we're going to move along the road, I believe, to get us to the B row of the board. And so we will go 5, 6, 7, 8. That would end our movement phase because all of our movement has not occurred along a road. To get from this building hex to the road was not along a road, and so we don't get the bonus for that second movement phase. We've used a total of 8 movement factors, 2 movement phases so far. Now we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movement factors, finishing our third movement phase. I'll bring the camera around here. We're going to continue along this road, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ending our fourth movement phase. All the movement along a road, so we can do 5 movement factors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This gives us our fifth movement phase. And then finally, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we are with our leader. If we count up all of those movement factors, going back over here, we went, so that took us a total of 6 movement phases. But let's figure out how many movement factors we use total. So 1, 2 to get over to this building hex, and then 2 more to get us to the ground level, that's 4. Then 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 to get us into those woods, and then 27 to get us into that clear hex with Sergeant Stoller. So 6 movement phases and a total of 27 movement factors. And Sergeant Stoller then commends us. Those who did it in 27 movement factors and 6 movement phases did well. You remembered to use the stairwell in X3 and the road bonus to move 5 hexes per movement factor for 3 turns. Fall out for chow. Fall in on the big yellow 2 on board 2 in 1 hour. Dismissed. Okay, here we are on board 2. Again in hex B8 on this board. So 2B8 is the hex that we're in. Since we're going to be staying on board 2 for a while, we'll just refer to the hexes as B8. Here we are with our leader. I'll go ahead and stack this multi-man squad, counter the squad on top of the leader. We'll do some of this initial movement on this board with our leader. And what Sergeant Stoller is going to tell us to do is work on some walls, hedges, and hills. So our first movement he's asking us to do is to go from B8 to B7. So that's 1 movement factor. Now if we want to go into the woods in B6, that's a total of 2 more movement factors for a total of 3. Now we're going to go into C6, which is an open hex. And that's 1 more movement factor. So now we've moved a total of 4 from the number 2 on B8. And then go into D5, which is this roadway hex over here. And that's another movement factor. So now we've moved a total of 5 movement factors. And 4 hexes. We could have gone another movement factor, and we just get a reminder here that we don't have to move through all of our movement factors in a turn. We just can't use more than the given number that we're allowed. Now, we see that there's a wall in front of us. This symbol here, this gray sort of thick line, represents a wall. And we're going to be going over that wall, apparently. So we're going to go into hex E5, which is this hex over here that's surrounded in 5 edges by the wall. And if we do that, we are going to use 2 movement factors to go over that wall. And now we're going to go into E4 over yet another wall. And that's another 2 movement factors for a total of 4 movement factors. And now we're going to take a new turn and go along the road here. So we're going to go along this road. We're on a road hex. So if we go to E3, E2, F1, G2, and H1, and I2, excuse me, then we have moved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 movement factors all along the road. So that allows us to do that in a single turn. And then we're going to do 1 movement factor along that road into hex I1 here, which is another area that looks like it's surrounded by some walls. Now, if we want to move over to J1, how many movement factors is that going to take us? Well, let's see. Each time we go over a wall, we have to use an extra movement factor. So that's why when we were over here and we wanted to get into E5, it would normally be 1 movement factor to move into that open ground. But because we crossed a wall, we had to add a movement factor to that. So it was 2 movement factors to go from here, then another 2 movement factors to go into this area. Say we wanted to go from where we are up here over this wall into hex J1, which is a woods hex. If there was no wall, we would use 2 movement factors to enter that hex. But because of the wall, we have to add 1. So going from here over the wall into J1 uses a total of 3 movement factors. Okay, Sergeant also wants us to move 1 additional hex from this woods to K2. And that's into an open hex. There's no walls or anything, so that's a single movement factor. Now we're going to learn about hills. So we can see on this board, unlike the previous board, there are these sort of tan or brown hexes that increase in darkness. And each increase in color, each darker shade of color represents a higher level of hill. So flat ground here we consider level 0. This lighter color is level 1. This next lighter color would be level 2. And then this darkest brown area here is level 3. So when we're going up hills, we have to use more movement factors to get up those hills. So we're going to start our way up that hill by working our way up through hex K3. So if we move our squad with its leader from K2 to K3, it's 1 movement factor because it's still open ground, but it's another movement factor because we've changed elevation from level 0 to level 1. So it's a total of 2 movement factors to get into that cell. Now if we go to K4, it's going to be another 2 movement factors. 1 for the regular movement and 1 for the change in elevation. So here we've now moved from K2 to K3, 2 movement factors, to K4, 2 more movement factors, for a total of 4 movement factors. And then if we wanted to go into K5, this cell right here, we continue our march, and now we go 2 more movement factors, because 1 for the actual movement to a new hex, and then 1 for the change in elevation. So going all the way from K2 on the road here up these hills to the top here has expended a total of 6 movement factors. Now, what you'll see is on the right hand edges of this particular hex are some dark, thick, jaggy lines which represent cliffs. Now it means we can't go along the cliff. We can't move along those cliffs from one hex to another at least without using climbing, which is something that we're not going to get into in this particular tutorial. So when we want to go downhill, there's no bonus for going downhill. Downhill movement is essentially the same as moving along the same level. So you don't have to pay extra movement factors to move downhill, but you don't get any kind of bonus for going downhill either. So let's work our way down the hill. Let's see, where does Sergeant Stoller want us to move? Okay, so now we're going to try moving downhill somewhat and see how that works. Remember that moving downhill, we don't get a bonus for moving downhill, but we also don't get a penalty. It's essentially like traveling on the same level. So Sergeant Stoller is giving us orders to start in here in K5 at this level 3 hill, work our way to K4, L4, and then M4. We go 1 hex to K4, and it's a single movement factor because we're going downhill. 1 more hex, for entering L4 because we are also going downhill again. 1 more hex. Remember that we couldn't go straight from K5 to L4 because of this cliff over here. Now, if we want to enter M4, here's a couple things going on. We know that it's a woods hex, but we also know that it's 1 level higher. When we're going uphill, I didn't make this clear previously, it doesn't just add a single movement factor to our movement, but it doubles the movement factor, whatever it is to enter that hex. So since we're entering a woods hex, which would ordinarily be 2 movement factors to move into, that's going to double because we're going uphill. So that single hex from L4 to M4 has a cost of 4 movement factors. Okay, so to move us from M4 here in the woods, say we want to get to M8. How many movement factors is that going to require? So we're in this woods, we're going to enter this hex here. We have to go up 1 level, so that doubles the movement factor from 1 to 2. Then if we go continue on to M6, making a mess here. M6 is downhill, so that's just 1 more movement factor. So that's a total of 3. We're going to go downhill, but we're going to enter woods. So there's no bonus or penalty or anything for changing elevation because we're going downhill, but we're entering a woods hex. That's 2 more movement factors, a total of 5 movement factors. To get us to M8 is 1 more movement factor. And that gets us our 6 movement factors for that movement phase. Now, what if we wanted to go into hex J9, which is this hex right over here, this woods hex. So we're going to be at this level 1 elevation, and we basically want to make a beeline for J9. How many movement factors is that going to involve? Well, we're going to enter the woods hex here, so that's 2 movement factors. A clear hex at the same elevation is 3. Then when we enter J9, that's 4 and 5 movement factors total. Okay, so you see that right next to this hex, there's this unusual hex in I9, which has woods and a building. And so when we want to move into a hex that contains 2 types of terrain, what you do is you basically add the movement factors that are needed to enter each of those types of terrain. So in other words, we have 2 hexes because it's a wooded hex, 2 movement factors because it's a wooded hex, and then 2 more movement factors because it's a building. So that would be a total of 4 movement factors to move that 1 hex from J9 to I9. The only time that type of terrain modification does not happen is when we are entering what's called brush at the edge of a woods hex. If there's brush and woods in a hex, it's considered that brush is just a natural part of the woods, and you don't add that movement penalty because the woods kind of already has brush in it. But otherwise, if you have woods and a building, you have to use the movement factor penalties for each of those to move into that hex. Okay, so now we're going to be getting into some movement while we're carrying things. In particular, this mortar here. Now you can't really see it, I believe, but if you are able to get one of these counters and look closely, right underneath the middle, or right and around the middle of this counter, is a notation that says 5 pp, 5 portage points. So this mortar and its ammunition has a total of 5 portage points. Now a squad by itself ordinarily can carry up to 3 portage points without any penalty to its movement. If you have a squad that's carrying more than 3, you lose 1 movement factor in its total movement phase for each portage point that goes over its inherent limit. So if this squad by itself, without the help of a leader, we're going to carry that mortar, then it would ordinarily have 4 movement factors per movement phase. If it's going to carry this mortar, though, because it's 2 portage points over its inherent limit, we're only going to have 2 movement factors per movement phase. So let's bring this mortar into the hex and see where we need to take it. Now, a leader has an inherent portage point capacity of 1 portage point. So that can actually be applied when we're with the leader, if the leader chooses to help us carry that mortar. And that would then only require us to lose 1 movement factor. Again, if you're moving with a leader and you do that entire movement, you get the 2 additional movement factors from 4 to 6 as your typical allotment. Now, what are we going to do? Let's see. If we wanted to take this, we're going to move our leader off to the adjacent hex here. He's going to be giving us orders from adjacent hex. So we're going to not be lifting or moving this with the help of a leader. And we wanted to move that mortar with our squad from the building here, this building woods hex, into I-8. So how many movement factors is that going to take us? Well, we're going to go into a woods hex, so that's 2 movement factors, and we're going uphill, so that's going to double that to 4 movement factors. Now, because we're carrying more than our inherent portage point allotment of 3, we have to subtract 2 movement factors from our usual movement phase allotment, which only gives us 2 movement factors. So we would need 4 movement factors to go into I-8 with that mortar, but we only have 2 movement factors available. What we can do then is a rule that's called minimum move. So when you're overextended in terms of what you're carrying, you can still move 1 hex by declaring minimum move, and as long as you would still ordinarily have 1 movement factor left after you deduct all the excess portage point costs, you can do the minimum move. Now, once we do that, that's going to take a lot of energy. This squad would be what's called pinned and exhausted, counter exhausted, CX. So that's going to have some penalties for what the squad can do in terms of combat during that turn. So here's a pin counter, and let me see if I can find a CX counter. So alongside that pin counter is our CX counter, which tells us the squad would be exhausted after it moves that minimum move to that cell. That doesn't mean we couldn't use another minimum move in our next movement phase, but that would happen in another turn. So we're going to basically move this mortar back into this wooded building hex. It's going to ordinarily take 4 movement factors. Again, we only have 2 because we're carrying 2 more than we need or we're able to carry. So when we move back into that hex, we're going to be pinned and counter exhausted. But now we'll rest and get rid of those two penalty hexes. So here we are in our hex with our mortar. Okay, so here we are in hex I9. Sergeant has given us the instruction to get rid of the mortar, so that's just disappeared. And also he has led the way all the way over here into hex T6. And he is asking us then, without leader to give us additional movement factor bonuses, how would we get from I9 to T6 in as few turns as possible? So let's figure out what we need to do here. If we wanted to probably see if we could get into moving along this flattish ground here, we would go from I9 to J8. That's going to take 2 movement factors because we're going up a hill into clear territory. Then we would go 3, and we would have to stop because at this point we can't really go into the woods hex because we only have 1 movement factor left. We can't go uphill into here. So that's 1 movement phase that we've used, 3 movement factors. Let's see if we can continue. 2 movement factors, 3 and 4. So that's our second movement phase. And that got us all the way to N8. Now if we continue on, I think if I go around this extra hill, that will probably be equivalent to going straight through, because we would have to double the movement factors to get into here. So if I go 1, 2, 3 into P7, I could also go 1, 2, 3 into P7. So it really doesn't matter. So we'll go the long way without the hill. 1, 2, 3, 4. That ends our third movement phase. And then finally, to get to T6, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. And that brings us to T6 in exactly 4 movement phases. All right, so here we are in hex T6 with our leader. And you'll notice that this hex is surrounded by cliffs on 4 hex sides. So if we say wanted to go down to this hex, U7, we would not be able to go straight down the cliff without doing crazy things like climbing, which we haven't learned how to do. Also, we'll see that that particular hex is littered with what are called shell holes. And so there are 2 options when we enter a hex that has shell holes. It can either be something that gives infantry cover, in which case it would take 2 movement factors to go through a hex with shell holes, but it would give us additional protection if someone were shooting at us. We can also go around the shell holes and treat it as if it's open ground with a single movement factor, but of course that would then leave our unit in the open and more vulnerable to being attacked. Now let's figure out how we can get down to that hex U7 from where we are in T6. Even though it's 1 hex away, we can't go straight there. So our steps would be from T6 to S7. That's 1 movement factor. There's more cliffs along this one, so really the only way we can get out of here is to go a second movement factor. We've gone downhill, but there's no penalty or bonus for doing that. So 2 movement factors so far. Then we go downhill once more for 3 movement factors. And then we can take the road to S8, 4 movement factors, 5 movement factors. And then in U7, well, we'll stay at T7 for now. We have gone 5 movement factors at T7. If we wanted, we could then end our turn. If we wanted to enter U7 where we actually go into the shell holes, that would require 2 movement factors. We only have 1 left with our leader bonus, so we would not be able to do that in the current movement factor. So we wait till our next turn to go into U7 and expend 2 movement factors, which gives us then the protection if someone is shooting at us. Now we can go over that wall into the hex U8, which is the one just below it. So there's 2 movement factors to get to the wall. There is we're going to stay within the shell holes, so we're going to go over the wall for 1 additional movement factor and stay in the shell holes for 2. That's a total of 3 movement factors to go from U7 to U8. Okay, and if we want to move from U8 into V8, which is this building, this wooden building, we have a 2 movement factor cost to enter the building, but we've also gone over this wall here, so we have to add 1 more. So moving from the shell hole hex in U8 over the wall to the building in V8 costs a total of 3 movement factors. And then if we wanted to move into the shell holes in V7, kind of a roundabout little route here, we have another wall that we have to go over. So 2 movement factors to move into the shell holes, and 1 more movement factor because we have crossed over a wall to do that. All right, so now we're given orders to march into hex U2. So what do? From where we are, we're now going to use road movement and not enter the shell holes. So we got 1 movement factor for U7, 1 more for U6, 3 for V5, 4 for V4, 5 for V3, 6 for U3. And because all of that movement has happened along the road, we get our 7th movement factor because we're with a leader into U2. Sergeant Stoller is now asking us to move from hex U2 to U1. So we're going to be going up a hill, and that's 2 movement factors because it's 1 for the hex and then 1 for the change in elevation, but we're also going over a wall. So that's 3 movement factors. And then if we wanted to get into V1, that's not a wall, it's actually a hedge, but it's treated the same as a wall in terms of movement because it's green. We're going to go back over this hedge in a different direction from U1 to V1. So because we're going downhill, there's no penalty or bonus for going changing our elevation downhill, but we do have to pay the extra movement factor for crossing that hedge. And that would be 2 movement factors. Now we're going to S2. Where is S2? That's this hex over here. But it's going to have us not go the straightaway anyway. Let's see what it's going to have us do. It's going to have us go 1 movement factor into U2, then go through T1. We're going to be entering a building and crossing a hedge. So it's two movement factors for the building and 1 for the hedge. So 3 movement factors to get from U2 to T1. Then we're going to go into S2, which is a single movement factor right over here. Now, Sergeant Stoller is asking us to go to hex BB5. So let me move the camera over a little bit here. Hex BB5, which is this hill hex with an elevation of 538 feet in as many or as few movement phases as possible. So let's see how many movement phases it takes us to get there. All right, so this time we're asked to go without our leader. Our leader is already there waiting for us. So we're here in S2. We want to get to BB5. What's the most efficient way to do that? Well, I think if we go along this road, we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movement factors. Again, because we have done all our travel along the road, we'd ordinarily have 4, but we get the road bonus of 1. That's one movement phase. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because we're going up a hill, we have to stop there. That's our second movement phase. Let's get the camera adjusted a little bit here. And then we now stay on the same elevation. 1, 2, but now to go up one more, 3, 4. And here we meet Sergeant Staller in exactly 3 movement phases. Okay, now in this next part of the day 1 course, Sergeant Staller has asked us to join him on board 4, which is a pretty open type of terrain, a lot of flat area, some yellow hexes, which are wheat fields, grain fields, and no elevation changes. So here we are on hex B8, right where the number 4 is, 4B8, with our leader. And we're being asked to march with our leader from B8 into C8, 1 movement factor, to D7, 1 more movement factor, E7, 1 more movement factor, F6, 1 more movement factor. So far we've done 4 movement factors. And then G7 and H7, 2 more movement factors, and that ends our movement phase at 6 movement factors. All in open terrain, flat, level, no changes, very simple type of movement. So you see now we're kind of surrounded by these yellow hexes, which are wheat fields. Actually, in the chapter K, they're called grain hexes, and the question is what are they? They could be anything like corn, wheat, barley. They're all kind of the same. In the original squad leader, they are wheat, and that's what I think of them as. Now, interestingly, depending on when the game scenario that you're playing is happening, what part of the year, these wheat fields may actually be either open terrain, which they are in the winter time from October to March, or in April or May, the fields are plowed, which means they cost more to move through. And in June through September, they are not freshly plowed, but there actually are crops growing in them, and that also slows you down. So to enter a grain hex, the movement cost is actually 1.5 movement factors. If it's during April through September. When it's October through March, it's just considered open ground. Now, 1.5 is not an even number of movement factors, so you have to have at least 2 movement factors left in order to be able to move into a grain hex because of that 1.5. If you only have 1 movement factor, you wouldn't be able to move in there. So we're going to start marching through this nice farmer's field here, doing 1 hex at a time. I'll just move the squad and have the leader sort of be with us. 1.5 movement factors to get us into I7. Then we go to J6. That's another 1.5 for 3 movement factors. Then if we go to K6, that's another 1.5 for 4.5 movement factors. And then K5, another 1.5 for a total of 6 movement factors. Since we're with our leader, or should have been, we're allowed to have 6 movement factors, and then we would have to stop. Now, Sergeant Staller is asking us to move all the way over to the other end of the board, which is way over here in F3. 5, and then by ourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and put our fearless leader in that hex, FF5, which is way over here at the junction of these roads. And we have to figure out how we get there. So here's our counter. And the instructions we've been given are to only go through hexes that are numbered 5. So we're in K5, but it's going to want us to go L5, M5, N5, O5, and so on, all the way down until we get to FF5 over here. I guess we're going to be asked how many movement factors and or movement phases is it going to take. How many movement phases? So let's see what we can do. So we're moving from N5 to FF5 by only staying in hexes that are numbered with a 5. So from K5 we have 1, 2, 3, 4 movement factors. That ends our first phase. I'll put one chip up here just to count these movement phases. To enter O5, we start a new movement phase, 1, 2. Then to go to P5, it's 3.5. We can't move into O5 because we would need 5 movement factors to do that. So that ends our second movement phase. To get to our third movement phase, we go to O5, that's 1.5. Then we enter, Q5, we enter R5, which is 2 more, so that's 3.5 movement factors. We don't have enough to enter the open terrain here, so that ends our third movement phase. Now, if I want to continue moving, we go 1, 2, 3, and again we have to stop. We don't have enough movement factors. We would need 4.5 to get into V5 over here, and we can't do it. So that ends our fourth movement phase. So let's continue. Entering the grain hex, 1.5 movement factors to V5, 3 to get us to W5, and then X5 would require another 1.5. Since we only have 4, we now have to stop our fifth movement phase. So again, I'm using these chips up here just to keep track of how many movement phases we have used so far. I'm going to bring the camera on over here. And continuing our movement on the row 5 hexes, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5. I can't enter hex AA5 because I only have a half a movement factor left. That ends our sixth movement phase. And it looks like for the most part it's pretty clear going, other than perhaps a wall. So let's see what we got. Go to AA5, 1, 2, 3, 4. We've finally been able to complete a movement phase without wasting any movement factors. That ends our 7th movement phase. And last but not least, we go over this wall. So this takes us 1 hex for the movement plus 1 for the wall. That's 2. And then we end our movement phase, our 8th movement phase, getting us to FF5. Next, Sergeant Stoller is going to ask us to go on to board number 3. Okay, here we are on board 3, which is a combination of different types of terrain, including some hills, a few buildings, and some roads. And Sergeant Stoller is already up here in hex 3E3, or simply E3, since we're going to be sticking that to board 3 for a little bit, and says how many movement phases and movement factors is needed to get from where we are down here in B8 to meet our leader in E3. So we would start our movement. Probably, I'm guessing we're going to go straight up and then across up here. So we start off with 1 movement factor, 2, 3 to get through the woods, and 4 onto this road. So that's 1 movement phase. Let's just mark that off with a counter. Keep track of that. And we've used 4 movement factors. Now we're going to continue in open ground, 1 movement factor, 2, 3, because we're moving up a hill, so it doubles. And then we have to basically stop here. That's 2 movement factors. We don't have enough, we only have 1 movement factor left, and we want to get up here, so we would need to go up one of these hills. We don't have enough to do it because we would need 2 movement factors. We only had 1 left. So that ends our second movement phase. So far we've used 7 movement factors. To get to E3, we could pick either one of these hills. I'll pick E4. 1, 2, because we're going up a hill. And then 3 movement factors to get us to E3. So that's a total of 3 movement phases and 10 movement factors. Okay, now the good sergeant wants us to move from the hill we're at E3 to where he has moved to I7, this other hill, peak of this hill. How many movement factors and movement phases is that going to take? Let's see. We're going to move straight across on the same level here, 1 movement factor. Going downhill has no penalty or bonus, so 2 movement factors. Staying on the same elevation, that's 3 movement factors. And then going downhill 1 more time. We're not going to go into the shell holes, so we're going to treat it as open terrain. No bonus, no penalty. So that's our 4th movement factor. And that ends our first movement phase. Now we have 2 options. We can go up either one of these 2 hills. And it's 1 movement factor for the movement and 1 for the hill. That's 2 movement factors. And then 2 more movement factors to get us to I7. So that ends our second movement factor and a total of 8, our second movement phase and a total of 8 movement factors. Okay, the sergeant has now moved over here into hex N1 on the second level of this building. We'll notice this is a multi-hex building that does have a stairwell, but the stairwell is in hex M2. So how do we get over there from where we are down here in hex I7? So we can do 1 movement hex downhill, no penalty, no bonus, just a single movement factor. So that's 1, 2, 3, and then 1 more movement factor. Even though we're going downhill, it's just an additional movement factor. So there's our 4th movement factor ending our first movement phase. We've used 4 movement factors so far. So continuing into that building, we're going to go 1, 2, and then to enter a building at ground level is going to be 3, 4, 2 movement factors. So we've now used our second movement phase and 8th movement factor. Now, we're in the hex that has the stairwell. So we can get into that, that second level of the building by going up 2 levels. And so that's 2 movement factors. And then we move now to where Sergeant Stoller is with our 2 more movement factors because we're moving within a building to a building hex. And so that's our 3rd movement phase, and we've used a total of 12 movement factors. Okay, Sergeant Stoller has now moved ahead to the building in R6. It's a 2 hex building, so it has 2 levels. There's no stairwell, so each hex has an inherent stairwell. Sergeant Stoller is on the 1st level of the building, up 1 level. So how many movement phases and movement factors is it going to take for us to get from the 2nd level here in N1 to the 1st level here in R6? Let's find out. So again, we're on that 2nd level. We can only go down to the next level by getting into that stairwell hex. So it's 2 movement factors to get to the 2nd level here in hex M2. And then it's going to take us 2 more movement factors to get on the ground level of M2. So we can get rid of our level thing. We've used 1 movement phase, and we've traveled 4 movement factors. So that's our first movement phase. Now I think we're just going to work our way through the, I guess it doesn't really matter. If we go to M3, that's 1 movement factor, we can either go around this wall to get us to hex M4, which would be 2 movement factors, or we can go over the wall, and it's also going to be 2 movement factors. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That gets us to N4. We've had our second movement phase, and we've moved a total of 8 movement factors. Now I think we can do a lot of road movement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Getting us to Q8. We were able to move 5 hexes because we stayed on the road. We started on the road, ended on the road, and all our movement occurred on the road. So that's the end of our third movement phase. We move 1 more to R7. Then we have to get into the ground level of R6, so that's 2 movement factors for a total of 3 so far. And then to move up 1 level to get to where Sergeant Staller is our 4th movement factor, ending our 4th movement phase. And we have expended a total of usually 4 movement factors per phase, but remember that our 3rd phase occurred along the road. So we actually used a total of 17 movement factors to get from the 2nd level of N1 to the 1st level of R6. Okay, Sergeant Staller is now asking us to go from 1st level of R6 all the way over here to W6, which is at the top of this hill. How are we going to do this? Well, our first step will be to expend 1 movement factor by going from the 1st level to the ground level. Then we're going to move into this open hex for 2 movement factors, then 3, then 4. So now we've used 1 movement phase and 4 movement factors. To get to that hill, we just have to work our way straight up. 1, 2 movement factors because we're going over 1 hex and going up in elevation. And the same thing to get us to the peak of that hill. 2 more movement factors. And that ends our 2nd movement phase, and we've expended a total of 8 movement factors. Okay, Sergeant Staller has now moved to hex DD2 at the top of this other hill, and is asking us to get from W6 at the top of this hill in the fewest number of movement phases and movement factors. What do we need to do? Well, it looks like maybe the straight shot is our best bet. So let's start moving. We have 1 hex going downhill, so it's a single movement factor. Going downhill again, it's 2 movement factors. Getting into this first grain hex gives us another 1.5 movement factors for a total of 3.5 movement factors. We can't move any further, so that's 1 movement phase. So that's 3.5 movement factors. Now, to move to the next movement phase, let's continue through the grain hex, assuming it's in season, and that's 1.5 movement factors. Now we're going to move into this woods hex. That's another 2 movement factors for another 3.5 movement factors. Doesn't give us enough movement factors to move any more in that movement phase, so that concludes our 2nd movement phase. Now we're going into open terrain, but uphill, so that's 2 movement factors and 2 more movement factors to get us to the top of that hill. That ends our 3rd movement phase. And how many movement factors was that total? That last one was 4. Then before that we had 3.5 and 3.5. That's 4 plus 7, which is 11 movement factors in 3 movement phases to get us to DD2. Our next part of the mission is going to take us onto a new board, board number 24. Okay, here we are on board 24. There's a lot of new terrain on this type of building, and this is the first board we've seen that was not part of the original squad leader system. So the number 24, unlike most of the other boards where the number was on hex B8, this is on hex C9. So we're on 24 C9 with our leader. And what we're seeing are some different types of terrain. Here in C8, where you have this darker green color, is what they call a valley. So if we consider ourselves at level 0, this valley is actually at level 0 or a -1. Then there are what are called gullies in that valley. This sort of brownish ditch-like symbol, which are actually at the bottom of those gullies are at level -2. This gully is actually also behind us in hexes B9 here, C10 here, and D9. And those are at gullies. So the gully is what they call a relatively narrow slit in the ground, referred to as a depression. It's possible to move within or around a gully. And the gully is always one level below the surrounding terrain. So the gully behind us here in C10, the ground is the same level 0 that we're already standing at. This gully itself is at level -1. All right, so we're going to go into C10 and enter the gully. So let's get our two squad counters together, move into C10 in the gully, and that takes 2 movement factors, because it's one to move into the hex and another to get us to that lower elevation into the gully. When we move into a gully, there is a movement cost for doing that. Now, if we want to then move into D9 while staying in the gully, that's going to cost us a total of 2 movement factors. So staying in the gully also costs 2 movement factors. And then we're going to descend into the valley into hex D8, again remaining in the gully. And that's going to be another 2 movement factors. So going from C9 to C10, which was 2, to D9, which was 2, and to D8, which was 2, is a total of 6 movement factors, ending our movement phase. Now you'll see here this dark cliff to our right, which would get us into cell or hex E9. And that prevents us from leaving the gully because the cliff is there. So we're going to go continue our movement into the gully, into hex E8. So since we're staying in the gully, that's 2 movement factors. And again, we still can't get into E9 because this cliff also exists along this hex side as well. Now there's also a cliff in our hex. This other thick line here is another cliff, which is actually going to prevent us from entering D7 unless we climb. So that's what's called a gully cliff. So this side of the gully actually has a cliff in it, which makes it impossible or harder to enter through that cliff into the cell or into the hex over here in D7 unless we do some climbing, which again we're not getting into. So we're going to continue in the gully into E7 for 2 more movement factors. That cliff is still, the gully cliff is still there to our left. And we can exit E7 along the gully in either direction. But if we want to leave the gully, the only thing that we could do would be, let's see, F6 maybe? If we go to F6, we could leave the gully from F7 entering the woods, but it would cost us extra movement points because we'd be entering the woods. But say we want to continue in F6, there's a stone bridge over that gully. So we're going to continue in the gully in F6. So we're actually underneath that bridge. for 2 more movement factors, and that ends our turn in that particular hex, or that movement phase. Here's what the sergeant says. We can leave this gully hex by any adjacent hex, but we cannot move directly to the bridge without climbing. We must first leave the gully and enter the bridge along the road up there. So follow me in the gully. So we're going to go to G6 for 2 movement factors. Right over here. Then go to H5, continuing in that gully. 2 more movement factors. So we've used 4 movement factors so far in this phase. And then we can either follow the gully to the right to I6 over here, or we can go up essentially to the left to H4. I6 is a combination woods gully hex. And it would cost 2 movement factors for the gully, plus 2 more for the woods if we wanted to enter that, for a total of 4 movement factors. Now H4, which is up here, you'll see this lighter kind of green symbol here represents brush. Brush also costs 2 movement factors to enter. And so moving to H4 in the gully would be 2 movement factors for staying in the gully, and then 2 more for entering the brush hex as well. Now to leave a gully and enter a non-gully, we have to enter higher ground, which is just like going to a higher level hill hex as far as movement factors are concerned. So if we are in H5 and we want to enter I5, which is this open hex right over here, how many movement factors would it cost? Well, it would be normally 1 movement factor to move into that hex, but because we started in a lower elevation, we're actually going up in elevation from -2 to -1, and so that's going to double the cost from 1 to 2 movement factors. Now if we go from say H5 to I6, which is this gully woods hex, it would be 4 movement factors, because we are taking 2 movement factors to continue along the gully, and the woods would also cost 2 movement factors. So that's a total of 4. Okay, so we're going to return to where we were in the gully of hex H5. It's a fairly complicated hex here with a branching gully. And the idea is that you can not only be in the gully, which we are now, or you can also be in the higher elevation in some portions of that hex by using what's called a crest marker, a crest counter. This crest counter can be aligned. I'm going to move our single man and multi-man counters on this so that the middle of this crest counter can be along one of the hex sides that does not intersect with the gully. So in other words, we have this hex intersection between hexes H5 and I5. I could align this crest counter here, which would mean we could be in this little upper portion of the hex on this side of the hex. I could also align the crest counter this way with G5, and we could be in this portion of the hex at that higher elevation, or I could align it with the intersection between H5 and H6, and which would allow us then to be in this portion of the crest counter. If we were in hex G6, there are 4 possible orientations for this crest counter. We can align it this way, which would mean we'd be in the area between G6 and G5. We can also align it this way, which will allow us to enter F5 or G between F5 and G6. We could also align it to the intersection with G7 or the intersection with H6. We would not be able to align the crest counter this way because the gully intersects this hex spine between G6 and H6. Now to enter crest status, you would expend an extra movement factor to get into that status. If you enter a hex with a depression or a gully into it from a non-depression hex, in other words, if we were in H6 and we wanted to enter the crest of G6 on this side, because we can cross into here, we could do that by simply entering a single movement factor, because it would be normally 2 movement factors to get into where that lower elevation is in the gully. This would be a single movement factor, if I did that right. So for this example, we're going to assume that we're in hex H5 in crest status with the crest facing hex I5. So let's get our counters here in the hex in crest status. So that means they're on top of that crest counter. So when we're in hex H5 and we want to move to I5, it would take 2 movement factors. One to leave crest status along the crest hex side, and then 1 to enter I5. So we would leave crest status and then enter I5. Now if we wanted to move from our crest status here between H5 and I5 into G6, this gully hex right over here, it would take 2 movement factors to get us back into the gully out of crest status, and then 2 movement factors to get us into G6 in the gully. And finally, if we're here in crest status again between H5 and I5 and we wanted to go to H6, again, because we're on the other side of that gully, it's going to take us 2 movement factors to get into the gully, and then 2 movement factors because we're going up an elevation from the gully to this open hex. 1 for the movement and 1 for the change in elevation. So 4 movement factors total to get from crest status between H5 and I5 to H6 or to the gully in G6. But it would only take 2 movement factors to get from crest status between H5 and I5 to get to I5, because we're already on that side of the gully. It's a little confusing, at least it is for me, but that's kind of how it works. Okay, now Sargent is asking us to move from hex I6, we're in a gully, to hex I7. So it's going to take us 2 movement factors to get from the gully to the higher elevation, and then 2 more movement factors, 4 movement factors total, because we're moving into this brush hex, which is going to have an additional movement factor penalty. Then if we were going to move to H7, it's no elevation change and it's clear terrain, so that's 1 movement factor. And then if we go to G7 along this road, it's another movement factor. So we've gone 4, 5, 6. That would end our movement phase. Now if we move to F6, we are now on the road. We're on the bridge of F6. We're at that higher level. The only way to enter or leave a bridge is across one of the 2 road hex sides. So we are on this bridge. We could not go directly into F5, G6, F7, or E7 from this location where we are now, because we're up on the higher part of the hex where the bridge is. We can only go to G7 or E6 directly. So we're going to continue across the bridge here to E6. Excuse me, with the camera. And that's one movement factor. D5, yet another movement factor. Then we're going to go to C5. We're now going up in elevation. So it's a one movement factor for the hex, plus doubling it for the change in elevation to level 0, which takes two movement factors. And then we're going to go to C4, same elevation, so that's one more movement factor, and C3, another movement factor, ending our movement phase. And then here we can see a couple things. If you look, I'll move these counters out of the way. If you look between hex C3 and D2, you can see that this lower elevation here, this valley, follows along that hex spine. So it's not a simple matter of expending just one movement factor to get from C3 here to D2. If we want to do that, it's called an abrupt elevation change. It's one movement factor to go down, plus the usual two movement factors to go up, for a total of three movement factors. So we would have one elevation change down for a movement factor in this abrupt change, and then two more to go up. That would be a total of three movement factors. Then we could go to E2. That's four movement factors. And then F1 in this brush is two more movement factors for a total of 6. Remember, brush, just like woods, costs 2 movement factors to enter. Then we're going to, in the next movement phase, we could continue on to G1. That would be 2 movement factors, again, through the brush. Now, from where we're sitting, we can see this other hex, a new type of terrain here, with these 4 boulder-looking kinds of terrain. That's called a crag, and it has rocks and boulders and some things. It does offer some protection from being fired upon, but it also slows you down and costs 2 movement factors per hex. So we're going to go into that valley from where we are in G1 into H1, and that's 2 movement factors because it's a crag. We don't have any penalty or bonus for going in lower elevation. Then we can move into H2. This would also be 2 movement factors because we're entering that gully. Now here we have a choice to either continue in the gully, if we were going to go to I3 over here, for 2 movement factors, or we could leave the gully by moving to G3 over on the other side, and that would also cost 2 movement factors. We could also go back to H1 over here, but that would be 4 movement factors because it would be 2 movement factors to get us out of the gully and then 2 movement factors to get us into the crag. However, we cannot go to I2, and the reason is that there is this cliff here between the 2 elevations, and so we're not able to go up that cliff. We could move to G2, but that would be going up 2 levels. We're in a gully, so we'd have to go 2 hexes to get to the upper level of this hex, and then 2 more to go up. And that would be 4 movement factors. So what we can do, in addition, is to move directly into H3, this hex here. So it's going to be 2 movement factors to get us out of the gully, and then 2 more movement factors to get us back in the gully. And that's 4 movement factors. Now, if we continue in the gully to H4, this is a brush gully hex. It would ordinarily, if this were an open terrain hex, with a gully in it, it would take 2 movement factors. But because we're not only going through the gully for 2 movement factors, we're entering brush, it's going to cost a total of 4 movement factors. So H4 gets us 4 movement factors. H5 in the gully is 2 more movement factors. And here we are again. This time we're going to leave the gully and follow the road. So we're going to go into H6. That's going to be 2 movement factors to get us up out of the gully. H7, we're not changing elevation. We're just entering onto that road hex. That's 1 movement factor. I8, we're going to continue along that road over here for 1 more movement factor. I'll bring the camera over here. J7, continuing along the road, 1 more movement factor. K7, 1 more movement factor. And here we will stop. We can see another type of terrain to our right, which is this orchard. The orchard symbol has these darker kind of tree symbols on a sort of organized pattern. And it costs 1 movement factor to enter, similar to open ground. It does offer a little bit more protection than open ground for being fired upon. We have no idea what kind of trees those are. They could be apples, they could be pears, they could be who knows what. So it doesn't really matter. We do want to enter that orchard hex, 1 movement factor. And then if we want to go to M8, we'll continue on through open ground, 1 more movement factor to get us into M8. And then if we want to move into L8, this would be a woods hex, but you'll notice there's these thin brown lines that travel through here. That's called a path. When you're traveling along a path, even through the woods, rather than expending 2 movement factors, you can do that by only expending a single movement factor. Then from L8 to K9 is yet 1 more movement factor. Now if we want to move into, let's see, L9, this will be a woods hex. It's going to be 2 movement factors. Now you'll notice at the edge of L9, between L9 and M9, there's this little body of water, a pond. And that does not allow us to cross directly from L9 to M9. We just can't cross there. It's just the pond blocks us because we can't swim and we don't have a boat. If we want to go to L9, we would have to go either through L8, back in this woods hex, or M10. So we're going to go into M10. So there's 2 movement factors plus the movement factors needed to increase elevation. So we're increasing elevation, so we're doubling that 2 movement factors to 4. And now we're going to go into M9, which is another woods hex. Down elevation, but there's no bonus or penalty. So that's 2 movement factors because it's woods. And then we're going to move into M8. This is only 1 movement factor because we're moving into open terrain and not changing elevation. M7, 1 more movement factor into that clear territory. N6, moving along the road here, is a 1 movement factor. Then we can go to O7, 1 more movement factor. P6, 1 more movement factor. Q7, which is this hex right here. That's another movement factor. And we'll stop here, and we'll see a couple new types of terrain, or 1 specific new type of terrain. Here on our left, in Q6, we see these little brown tiny rectangles. That's what's called a lumber yard, and it's equivalent to a single-story wooden building. That means to enter it, it would be 2 movement factors. So if we go across that lumberyard. We can go into Q6, so that's 2 movement factors. Q5 is 2 more movement factors. We can then go into Q4. To do that, we just crossed this hedge, this dark green line, and so that costs 2 more movement factors to get us onto that road hex, because we're not changing elevation. Now that we're on the road, we can go to R3, that's a movement factor, to S4, 1 more movement factor, and to T3, 1 more movement factor. And we'll see on our right is a new type of building. This building here. It's a little bit different than other buildings we've seen. It's a stone building because it's gray, and you'll notice that it has stairwells in both hexes. So that means it has 3 levels, a ground level, a first level, and a second level on each hex. You'll also notice that this building is on 2 different levels of elevation. This is the lower level of elevation. This is a higher level of elevation. So what that means is level 1 in this hex in U4 connects with the ground level of this part of the building. So this building kind of has like a multi, type of building. It's kind of hugging a hill. So 1 level on this hex corresponds to a different level on that hex. There are 3 levels on each hex, but this building has actually 4 different levels. The ground level of U4 here is lower than the ground level on V3 and doesn't connect to any other level. So if we enter the building from where we are, from T3, we can enter that into U4. That would cost 2 movement factors. Now we're on the ground level of U4. Now if we want to go to the first level of U4, we can do that with our level counter and bring our counters up to level 1. Sorry about the mess here. So here's our leader. Here is our squad. And if we want to now go to V3, we can do that. We can enter the ground level of V3 because the first level of U4 is connected to the ground level of V3. It's a straight shot. So we can move directly over without our level counter. Now we're on the ground level of U4. We can then use 2 more, that was 2 movement factors to move from here to here. We can do another movement factor by getting onto the first level. And then, let's see. Well, no, we would stay on the ground level, actually. And let's see what happens after this. Okay, when we last left this, we were on the ground level of V3. And now we're going to leave the building and use the path to enter W4. And that is 1 movement factor. Again, because we're going, even though we're in the woods, we're going through a path. And then we can follow that path to W5, to W6, to V6, to W7, W8, and X8. And that gives us a total of 6 movement factors. It would have cost 12 if we were not going on a path. So the path allows us to go through woods or brush using only a single movement factor per hex. Now we can enter the orchard in X9. Orchards cost 1 movement factor to enter. And then if we go to Y10, that's an open area with a road hex in it, that's another movement factor. So that gives us a sense of some of these different kinds of terrain. Personally, I find the gullies very confusing, but we've had a little bit of practice, and hopefully this will help us when we're playing scenarios that have gullies in them. Okay, well, our sergeant has called us back to board 1, right here where the number 1 is. So we're going to stack our 2 counters here in 1B8, or just B8, since we're going to be working on board 1 for a little bit. And we're going to cover double time. What happens when we not only have a leader that allows us to move not only 4 movement factors, but 6, but when we have a leader who is encouraging us to go even faster, we could actually cover 8 hexes in a single movement phase. And so let's find out how we would get away with this. So first we're going to get into from B8 to C8, 1 movement factor, to D7, 1 movement factor. That's 2. To E7 is 3. F7 is 4. G8 is 5. H8 is 6. I9 is 7. And J8 is 8 movement factors. Now that was quite a lot of distance in one single turn. But now we have done 8 movement factors, and that's called double time movement. It increases your normal movement factor allotment by 2 only if you're not broken, wounded, or CX. It reduces your ability to carry things by 1, but since we weren't carrying anything, it's irrelevant. But what that does do, you have to declare double time at the beginning of your movement phase, and it earns you this CX counter, which stands for counter exhausted. Here it says IPC, which is your inherent portage capacity, is reduced by 1, and there's some additional penalties for close combat, I guess. I think that's what CC stands for. So that CX stands for counter exhaustion, which means until we fire in our next prep fire phase or break or begin to move in our next movement phase, we're going to be prevented from doing double time movement again. So in other words, we have to now do a little bit of rest. And other things like doing a minimum turn can also cause CX and prevent double timing and other things. You can do CX movement through other kinds of terrain. It doesn't have to be only open. But how many movement factors can we expend in our next movement phase? Only 6, because we're still CX. Now, when you are CX, that means you have a problem in combat because you have to add 1 to your rolls for attacks that you make, and your opponent can get a bonus -1 when they're fighting you in close combat. So you generally don't want to use CX unless it's necessary to cover a particular amount of terrain. However, once a turn has passed, and we'll assume that that's happened, this CX counter can then go away, basically meaning that our squad and leader have had time to catch their breath and are no longer exhausted. So if we were to do all of our movement on the road, we can actually move even more than 8 hexes. So we're going to go to V4 using double time and CX. So here we are in J8. We're going to go all the way to V4, which is over here. And we're going to double time it. So let's see how far we can get with our friendly CX counter. Okay, so if we're on the road and we want to move along that road towards V4, we're going to double time. So we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We can actually move one more in this turn because we've done all our movement on the road, and that gets us 9 movement factors in a single movement phase because all of that movement was with a leader and along the road. So double time allows you to get those 2 extra movement factors. So we're going to say if we waited here a turn, this counter exhaustion would go away. But ordinarily, you would declare double time movement at the beginning of your turn before you start moving. It is possible to declare double time movement, CX, during your move, as long as you still have some movement factors left. But that only allows you to take 1 extra movement factor. Now, if you're desperate under certain situations, that can still be beneficial, even though it seems like it's not very helpful. For example, if we are going into T5, we're going to keep moving towards that building in V4. Say we're going to move 1 movement factor to T5, then U6, 1 movement factor, V6, that's 3 movement factors total. W7 gets us into 4. Then X6 is 5 movement factors. Now suppose in a game, I got us off the board here a little bit, off the camera's sight. Suppose in this game now there was a machine gun from an enemy unit here in hex Z6 that started firing on us. Well, we may want to choose then to declare double time because that gives us 1 extra movement factor, which would allow us to get into, say, the building over here in X5. Remember, we've expended 5 movement factors so far to get us to X6. Wasn't all along the road, and we haven't been using double time. So we really only have 1 movement factor left. We wouldn't want to start moving into this open territory here because this machine gun would obviously have a heyday with us. So to get us out of this open terrain, we can declare double time at the last minute. We only get 1 extra movement factor. We already had 1. Now we get 1 more. That gives us just enough to get into that stone building, which will help protect us from the fire from that machine gun in Z6. So here we are in the building in hex X5 at ground level, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's called bypass movement, which allows us to actually go around certain building or woods hexes without actually entering the building or woods terrain, if the depiction on the hex allows us to do that. So for example, from where we are here in X5, we could not bypass into X4 because hex X4 is a completely interior building hex. There's no open ground anywhere even in that hex. However, we could enter W5 using bypass movement because there's a little bit of open territory here that in principle we could get around. So it would be 1 movement factor to enter W5 along this hex spine because this hex spine is adjacent to our hex. So we can kind of do that to get us into this vertex here between those 3 hexes. So we're at the intersection of hexes W5, W6, and V5. And from here, we could continue on to any of those 3 hexes with normal movement. So we could cost 2 movement factors to get into the W5, 2 movement factors to get into the building at V5, one movement factor to get us into W6 if we wanted to. And we can also use one movement factor to get us to this hex spine between W4, V4, and W5, because there's just barely enough room there where there's that vertex is in open territory. And whenever we use bypass, you're basically going from vertex to vertex. And that basically means you're limiting the number of places you can move to next, right? You're either going to move to another vertex in open territory, or you only really have 3 options for where you can go. You could, in principle, continue bypass in W5 along the hex between W5 and W4, for example, over here. But that would also cost 1 movement factor. Probably it would be better, according to the chapter K, to just move into W5 for 2 movement factors, because that would give us some cover. And then you could continue to enter V4 or V5 in bypass movement, because again, these buildings also have open terrain all around them. As long as the first hex side that's bypassed in those hexes is part of our current vertex, we can continue to use bypass to enter one of those hexes. You can never use your last movement factor for bypass. You can never willingly end your movement phase using bypass. Even if you are forced by enemy fire to end your movement phase in bypass, you are considered to return to the hex center after all defensive first fire against you is resolved. So unless we're broken or pinned, we can't end our movement phase at a vertex. If I want to end a movement phase without entering a hex, you can pay 2 additional movement factors to enter the hex we're already in. And that gets you from a movement vertex to the center of a hex. So we're going to go into W5. Here, W5, into that building for 2 hexes. So as an example, it's asking if we suppose that when we entered the W5, V4, V5 vertex here, is that the right one? No, W5, V5, V4. Suppose in T4 there was a machine gun that could fire at us, because now we're sort of in between these and there's an open line of sight. If it didn't hit us but could keep a rate of fire, that would be a problem. So we may want to pay the extra 2 movement factors to regain the +3 terrain effects modifier of being in W5 in that stone building. These are kinds of situations, I guess, in combat that will come up and be some things to consider. So bypass is dangerous because you're essentially in open ground. You don't get the benefit of being protected by the woods or the building that you're in, and there's actually a bonus that the person attacking you may have because you're in open ground. So it does make you more vulnerable. So Sergeant has asked us to move to W2 and work through an example of some of the dangers, perhaps, of bypass movement. So if we're in W2, we start a next turn there, and we suppose that in Z1, Z1 is this wooden building over here, that there was an enemy unit with a machine gun in that cell. So we don't want to be caught in the open in the line of sight of that machine gun. So we definitely want to get that unit, our squad, out of the way. We could enter X2, which is this building hex, at a cost of 2 movement factors. If we do that, the machine gun does get to fire at us because it has a line of sight to X2 as well as to the hex that we started in. However, if we declare bypass along the X2W3 vertex here, because it's related to the cell, we could in principle bypass movement over here to that vertex. That actually protects us from the line of sight of that machine gun. From that vertex. But suppose a hidden enemy now in T4 in this building over here, right at the edge of the screen, had a machine gun or any squads. They could fire at us now because they would have a line of sight. And that would be difficult because now instead of the +3 TEM that the stone building would give us, we basically now end up with a -2 bonus that they would have firing on us in open ground. So bypass, I guess is a good way to increase your movement capabilities and to help avoid enemy line of sight. But if you're not careful about where your enemies are, it could actually put you in a worse condition because you end up in the line of sight of another enemy. Every vertex position occupies a portion of 1 hex. The first hex referred to in its vertex coordinate. So at any rate, we can't stay here, so we'll enter X3, which is 2 movement factors, and then we're going to go, because X3 has a stairwell, we will go up 2 levels, and that's 2 more movement factors. And then we're going to double time into W4. And that's 2 more movement factors. And doing that requires us to put a counter on because we've moved more than our share of movement factors. So here we are in W4 on the 2nd level of this building, and this is one of the places we ended up in our initial training module. And so now this is asking us to say get back to B2, which is all the way over on the other end of the board over here, allowing us to use bypass movement as a way to shorten our path. And we'll be able to use double time. Okay, well, with these newfound skills of double timing and bypass, how many movement factors and movement phases will it take to get us to B2 from the 2nd level here in W4? We're still exhausted from our last set of movement, so we can only move the normal allotment here. It's going to take us 2 movement factors to get to the ground level. Oh, no, wait a minute. We have to move to the hex that has the stairwell. So 2 movement factors to get us... actually, I need to get rid of our leader. Our leader is going to be all the way at the other end of the board waiting for us. So 2 movement factors to get us into X3 where the stairwell is, and then 2 more movement factors to get us to that bottom ground level. That's our first movement phase. So we'll mark that with a counter just to keep track of that. We've done 4 movements. Now we can get rid of the CX counter because we've only done a normal amount of movement. We caught our breath. And let's begin the trek. We're going to reignite double time, which gives us 2 additional movement factors. And we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we've done 2 movement phases, and we've done a total of 10 movement factors. Because we are exhausted, we can only go our normal allotment of movement factors, but we're going to be moving along the road. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that gives us the ability to get rid of our exhaustion. But we're going to declare double time again and allow us to get the 2 additional movement factors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again, that's 5 for being on movement, plus the 2 for the CX, because we're double timing. Now that we're exhausted, we have to go back to a normal amount of movement factors. I think that got us our 4th movement phase, if I counted right. So we're exhausted, so we can't do any extra movement here. But we're on the road, and we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. That ends our 5th movement phase. Now we get rid of the counter exhaustion. And then in our 6th movement phase, we can go directly into 1 movement factor, and we don't have to go any further. Okay, so bypass movement seems to allow us to make ourselves a little bit more vulnerable at the benefit of being able to move further. But it's also possible to do the opposite, where we actually give up some movement at the benefit of being able to be a little bit less vulnerable. And that's called a dash. So from where we are here in B2, we can enter these woods in C3. That would be 2 movement factors. And then assume we want to cross the street here in D3 and run into that building here in E4. And we can do what's called declaring a dash. And if we dash, we can do that if we have enough movement factors to traverse the terrain, and assuming we started our turn in this woods hex. Okay, so we're basically, after we've moved there, we've just said that's our end of our turn, our movement phase. We're going to start a new one in the next movement phase. So we're at the beginning of our movement phase. We haven't expended any movement factors, and we would have enough to be able to get into that building, right? Because it would be 1, 2, 3 movement factors to get from the woods hex in C3 to the building hex in E4 at ground level. So we declare what's called a dash. We can dash from a non-open ground hex into the street and then directly into a non-open ground hex on the other side of the street. And that ends our movement phase. So in this case, we would only be able to move those 3 movement factors, we wouldn't be able to do any additional movement after that. But what that does is anyone who may be in a position to fire on us with a machine gun, say here in F1, or their inherent firepower, if they were gonna try to fire at us while we were crossing the street, because we are dashing, they would have half their firepower. Although, of course, we're still doing a negative die roll modifier because we're moving in open ground. So that would still apply, but their firepower would be halved. And so that would be a good way to try to minimize the danger of running across open ground when you're going from like a building to a building, or woods to a building, or to woods across open ground like a road. Okay, well that looks like we have made it through day 1 of Chapter K. I hope this has been useful to someone other than myself. I've learned a little bit about kind of how all the terrain movement happens. I still admit I'm confused about gullies and valleys and how we get around those. But I have a feeling it's one of those things where practice makes perfect. All right, I'm going to log off. Thanks.